The August heat pressed down on Austin like a weight, shimmering off the Capitol dome as Governor Bill Crawford wheeled himself up the ramp. To his office, the Texas sun was unforgiving, but Bill had learned long ago that the political heat could burn just as fierce. "Governor, we've got a situation," his chief of staff, Maria Santos, said as she fell into step beside his wheelchair. Her heels clicked against the marble floor of the Capitol Rotunda, echoing in the vast space adorned with portraits of Texas heroes. "When don't we?" Bill replied, his weathered hands gripping the wheels of his chair with the same determination that had carried him through 23 years in Texas politics. At 58, his hair had gone silver, but his blue eyes still held the fire that had made him a force to be reckoned with. Since his days as a district attorney, Maria handed him a folder thick with documents. The Riverside Independent School District. They've implemented what they're calling inclusive policies without parental notification. We're talking about gender identity counseling, preferred pronouns, and bathroom policies, all without telling parents. Bill's jaw tightened as he flipped through the pages. The hallway buzzed with the usual Capitol activity staffers hurrying between offices, lobbyists in expensive suits, and reporters with their ever-present notebooks. But Bill's focus was laser-sharp on the documents before him. "How many districts?" he asked. "Riverside's the biggest, but we've got reports from at least 6 others across the state. Houston, Dallas suburbs, even some smaller towns. It's spreading like wildfire." They reached the governor's office, a spacious room with tall windows overlooking the Capitol grounds. The Texas flag hung proudly beside the stars and stripes, and the walls were lined with photographs from Bill's political career, including one from the day he'd been sworn in as governor, his wife Sarah and their 3 children standing beside his wheelchair. "Get me Superintendent Morrison on the phone," Bill said, settling behind his desk, "and call an emergency meeting with the Education Committee chairs. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with here." "Hey, before we continue, let me ask you, have you liked and subscribed to the channel yet? No? Then take advantage now and click the subscribe button below. And leave a comment with what you think of this video and which city you're watching it from. Your participation is very important to us. It helps our channel grow and bring more content like this. I'm counting on you. Now, let's continue. As Maria left to make the calls, Bill stared out at the Capitol grounds. A group of school children was taking a tour, their excited voices carrying through the window. He thought about his own kids, Michael, now 25 and a teacher himself, Emma, 22 and finishing law school, and David, 18 and heading to Texas A&M in the fall. His phone buzzed. "Governor, I've got Superintendent Morrison from Riverside ISD on line 1. Bill picked up the phone, his voice taking on the measured tone that had served him well in countless political battles. "Dr. Morrison, this is Governor Crawford. I think we need to have a conversation." "Governor," came the nervous reply, I was expecting your call." "I'm sure you were." "Dr. Morrison, I'm looking at some policies here that seem to have been implemented without proper oversight or parental involvement. Can you help me understand what's happening in your district?" There was a pause. Then Morrison's voice came back, steadier now. "Governor, we're simply trying to create a safe and inclusive environment for all our students. These policies are based on best practices from—" "Dr. Morrison," Bill interrupted, his tone sharpening. "I'm not interested in where these policies came from. I'm interested in why parents in your district are calling my office saying they had no idea their children were being counseled on gender identity issues without their knowledge or consent." "Governor, with respect, these are complex issues that require—" "Complex?" Bill's voice rose slightly. "Dr. Morrison, there's nothing complex about a parent's right to know what's happening with their child in school. Nothing complex about transparency. Nothing complex about the fact that parents, not bureaucrats, are responsible for raising their children." The line went quiet for a moment. Outside, the tour group of children had moved on, but Bill could still hear their laughter echoing across the grounds. Double quotes. "Dr. Morrison, I'm going to be very clear with you," Bill continued. "Texas has always been a state that values parental rights, local control, and common sense. These policies you've implemented, they run counter to all 3. I want a full report on my desk by Friday, and I want to know exactly how you plan to address this situation. Governor, if I may, you may not. This conversation is over. Dr. Morrison, but this issue isn't, not by a long shot. Bill hung up the phone and immediately buzzed Maria. Get me the Attorney General's office and start drafting a press release. We're calling a press conference for tomorrow morning. As Maria hurried back into the office, Bill turned his chair to face the window again. The late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the Capitol grounds, and he could see the first hints of evening in the sky. What are you thinking, Governor? Maria asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Bill was quiet for a moment, his mind racing through the political calculations, the legal implications, and the moral imperatives that had brought him to this moment. I'm thinking, he said finally, that we just drew a line in the sand. And Maria, yes, sir. Make sure that press conference is on the Capitol steps. I want every Texan to see exactly where their governor stands on this issue. As the sun set over Austin, Bill Crawford sat in his office, knowing that tomorrow would bring a firestorm unlike any he'd faced in his political career. But he'd faced storms before, literal and political, and he'd learned that sometimes the only way through was to stand firm and fight. The morning air was crisp for August in Austin, with just enough breeze to lift the flags behind the podium that had been set up on the Capitol steps. By 9 a.m., the crowd had already gathered, reporters with cameras, supporters waving Texas flags, and protesters with signs reading "Protect Trans Kids" and "Love Wins." Governor Bill Crawford adjusted his tie as he reviewed his notes one final time. Behind him, the Capitol dome gleamed in the morning sun, its star reaching toward a sky that seemed to promise either hope or trouble, depending on where you stood. Governor, we've got about 200 people out there, Maria said, checking her watch. Channel 8, Fox, CNN, and about a dozen other outlets. This is going to go national. Bill nodded, folding his speech and tucking it into his jacket pocket. Good. Texas has always been a leader, Maria. Time to lead again. As he wheeled himself to the podium, the crowd quieted, cameras clicked and whirred, and Bill could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. My fellow Texans, he began, his voice carrying clearly across the Capitol grounds. I stand before you today not as a politician, but as a father, as a husband, as someone who believes that the sacred bond between parent and child is the foundation of our society. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Bill had learned long ago that the best political speeches weren't about politics at all. They were about the values that united people across party lines. Over the past week, I've received hundreds of calls from parents across our great state, mothers and fathers, who discovered that their children were being counseled on issues of gender identity in school without their knowledge, without their consent, and without their involvement. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Now, let me be clear, Bill continued, his voice growing stronger. Every child in Texas deserves to feel safe in school. Every child deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. But parents have a fundamental right to know what's happening with their children. They have a right to be involved in decisions that affect their kids' lives. From the crowd, a voice called out, "What about trans kids who aren't safe at home?" Bill paused, his expression softening slightly. That's a fair question, and it deserves a thoughtful answer. As governor, I've supported funding for child protective services, for counseling programs, and for resources to help vulnerable children. But the solution to protecting some children isn't to exclude all parents from the process. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Folks, I've been in this wheelchair for 32 years. I know what it's like to face challenges, to feel different, to struggle with identity. But I also know that it was my family, my parents, my wife, my children who gave me the strength to overcome those challenges. A reporter in the front row raised her hand. Governor Crawford, critics say this is just another attack on LGBTQ rights. How do you respond? Bill's eyes flashed with the intensity that had made him a formidable prosecutor years ago. Sarah, isn't it? From Channel 12. That's right, Governor. Sarah, I want you to listen carefully, because this is important. This isn't about LGBTQ rights. This isn't about attacking anyone. This is about parental rights. This is about transparency. This is about the idea that in Texas, parents, not bureaucrats, not activists, not politicians, parents are responsible for raising their children. Another reporter called out, "Governor, what specific actions are you planning to take?" Bill straightened in his wheelchair, his voice taking on the authoritative tone that had served him well in countless courtrooms and legislative battles. "First, I'm directing the Texas Education Agency to conduct a comprehensive review of all school district policies regarding gender identity and parental notification. Second, I'm calling on the legislature to convene a special session to address these issues. And third, I'm instructing the Attorney General's office to investigate whether any laws have been violated." The crowd erupted in cheers and boos, the divide clearly visible in the sea of faces before him. "Governor," another reporter shouted over the noise, "are you concerned about federal pushback on these policies?" Bill's jaw set in a way that Maria had learned to recognize it meant he was about to say something that would make headlines. "Let me tell you something about federal pushback," Bill said, his voice rising above the crowd noise. "Texas has been dealing with federal overreach. For decades, we've fought in court, we've stood our ground, and we've won. If Washington wants to pick a fight with Texas over parental rights, well," he paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "they're welcome to try." The crowd exploded in cheers and applause, drowning out the protesters' chants. Bill sat back in his wheelchair, knowing that the battle lines had been drawn. As the press conference ended and the crowd began to disperse, Maria approached the podium. "Governor, your phone's been ringing off the hook. Governors from Florida, Missouri, and South Carolina want to talk." And she paused, consulting her notes. The White House called. Bill chuckled as he wheeled away from the podium. "I bet they did. What did they want?" "They want to discuss your concerns about federal education policy." "How diplomatic of them," Bill said, his tone dry. "Tell them I'll be happy to discuss my concerns right after they start respecting the 10th Amendment." As they made their way back into the Capitol, Bill could see the news vans lining the street, their satellite dishes pointing toward the sky like mechanical flowers reaching for the sun. By evening, his words would be broadcast across the nation, and by tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But for now, he had work to do, phone calls to make, meetings to schedule, and a strategy to develop. Because Bill Crawford had learned long ago that in politics, as in life, it wasn't enough to take a stand, you had to be prepared to defend it. The phone in Bill's office had been ringing constantly for 3 days. By Thursday morning, Maria had fielded calls from governors in 12 states, 3 cable news networks, and what seemed like every major newspaper in the country. The story had gone national, just as Bill had expected. "Governor, you need to see this," Maria said, rushing into his office with a tablet in her hands. "It's from the Riverside School Board meeting last night." Bill took the tablet and watched the video. The Riverside High School auditorium was packed to capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling into the hallways. Parents clutched printed copies of the district's policies, their faces flushed with anger and concern. "This is our children we're talking about," a woman at the podium was saying, her voice shaking with emotion. "I have a right to know what's happening in my daughter's school." The crowd erupted in applause, but Bill could see the tension in the room. On one side sat parents holding signs reading parental rights and transparency now. On the other side, a smaller but vocal group held rainbow flags and signs reading "Protect Trans Kids" and "Love Not Hate." How did it end? Bill asked, though. He suspected he knew. 3-hour meeting. Lot of shouting. Board voted for 2-3 to maintain their current policies, but agreed to form a community engagement committee to address concerns. Bill shook his head. "Political cover. They're hoping this blows over, Governor." Maria said carefully, "We've got some pushback brewing. The Texas Democratic Party is calling for a press conference this afternoon, and there's a group of parents planning a counter-protest at the Capitol tomorrow." Bill turned his wheelchair to face the window, looking out at the Capitol grounds where a few tourists were taking pictures. The morning sun was already hot, promising another scorcher of a day. What are they saying? He asked. That you're targeting vulnerable children. That this is part of a larger attack on LGBTQ rights. That you're using fear to score political points. Bill was quiet for a moment, his hands folded in his lap. After 32 years in politics, he'd learned that the hardest battles were often the ones where both sides believed they were fighting for something righteous. You know what? Maria, get me a meeting with some of these parents who are planning the counter-protest. Real parents, not political operatives. I want to hear what they have to say. Maria looked surprised. Governor, that's not usually how these things work. I know, but maybe that's the problem. Bill turned back to face her. Set it up. Somewhere neutral. Not the Capitol, not a school. Maybe the community center on South Lamar. And Maria, yes, sir. Make sure the media knows it's happening. If we're going to have this conversation, we might as well have it in the open. 2 hours later, Bill found himself in a circle of folding chairs in a community center that smelled of coffee and floor wax. Across from him sat 6 parents, their faces a mixture of wariness and determination. I appreciate you all coming. Bill began, his voice softer than the one he'd used at the press conference. I want to hear your concerns, and I want you to understand mine. A woman in her 40s with short brown hair leaned forward. Governor, my daughter is transgender. She's 15, and she's been struggling with her identity for years. The school counselor has been a lifeline for her, someone she can talk to when she can't talk to us. And why can't she talk to you? Bill asked, genuinely curious. The woman's eyes filled with tears. Because I didn't handle it well at first. I was scared, confused. I said things I regret. The school counselor helped her, and eventually helped me understand what my daughter was going through. A man sitting beside her nodded. Governor, my son is gay. He's 17, and he was terrified to tell us. The school's LGBTQ+ support group saved his life literally. He was having thoughts of hurting himself. Bill felt the weight of their words. I'm sorry you and your families went through that. I truly am. But help me understand, wouldn't you have wanted to know your children were struggling? Wouldn't you have wanted the chance to help them? Of course, the woman said. But some parents aren't accepting. Some kids get thrown out of their homes. Some get sent to conversion therapy. And some parents, Bill said quietly, love their children unconditionally and just want to be involved in their lives. The room fell silent. Finally, a younger woman with glasses spoke up. Governor, what if there was a way to protect both? To ensure parental involvement while also protecting vulnerable kids? Bill leaned forward. What do you mean? What if schools were required to notify parents, but there was also a process for kids who genuinely feared for their safety? A way to involve counselors, social workers, maybe even family therapy, like a safety net within a safety net. Another parent added. Bill was quiet for a long moment, his mind working through the implications. That's actually not a bad idea. It addresses the transparency issue while still protecting vulnerable children. The meeting continued for another hour, with parents sharing stories, concerns, and ideas. By the time it ended, Bill realized something important. This wasn't really about politics at all. It was about families trying to navigate an incredibly complex and emotionally charged issue. As the parents filed out, the woman with the transgender daughter approached Bill's wheelchair. Governor, she said, I still disagree with some of your policies, but I appreciate you listening to us. That means something. Bill extended his hand. Ma'am, I may be the governor, but I'm a parent first. I want what's best for all our children, yours and mine. As Bill wheeled himself out of the community center, he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward that didn't require anyone to compromise their deepest values. But as he reached his car, he saw Maria waiting with her phone in hand, her expression grim. Governor, we've got a problem. The Federal Department of Education just announced they're opening an investigation into Texas school policies, and the White House is calling for a meeting. Bill sighed as his security detail helped him into the car. The battle was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The Oval Office had never felt smaller to Bill Crawford. Despite the grandeur of the room, the famous resolute desk, the presidential seal woven into the carpet, The portraits of past presidents watching from the walls. Bill felt the weight of federal power pressing down on him like the August heat back home in Texas. President Jennifer Walsh sat across from him, her expression carefully neutral. The first woman to hold the office, Walsh had built her career on coalition building and compromise. But Bill could see the steel beneath her diplomatic smile. "Governor Crawford," she began, her voice measured and professional, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. These are complex issues we're dealing with." "Madam President," Bill replied, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, "I appreciate the invitation. Though I have to say, when the federal government starts investigating state education policies, it doesn't feel much like an invitation." Walsh's Secretary of Education, Dr. Michael Harrison, shifted in his chair, a former superintendent from California. Harrison had been vocal about his opposition to what he called discriminatory state policies. "Governor," Harrison interjected, "our investigation is simply ensuring that all students have access to a safe and supportive learning environment. Title X protections require." "Dr. Harrison," Bill interrupted, his voice taking on the prosecutorial edge that had served him well in courtrooms. "With all due respect, Title X was written to protect women's sports and educational opportunities. It wasn't written to allow schools to counsel children on gender identity without parental knowledge." President Walsh raised a hand. "Gentlemen, let's keep this productive. Governor Crawford, help me understand your position. Are you saying that schools should never be able to support students who are struggling with identity issues?" Bill leaned forward slightly. "Madam President, I'm saying that parents have a fundamental right to know what's happening with their children. If a child is struggling with identity, with depression, with anything, the solution isn't to cut parents out of the process. It's to bring them into it." "And what about children whose parents aren't supportive?" Walsh asked. "What about kids who face rejection or even violence at home?" "Then we have child protective services. We have counselors. We have family therapy. We have a whole system designed to protect children while keeping families together when possible." Bill's voice grew more passionate. "Madam President, you have children. If your daughter was struggling in school, wouldn't you want to know? Wouldn't you want the chance to help her for the first time?" Walsh's diplomatic mask slipped slightly. "Of course I would. But not every parent is like us." "Governor, no, they're not, but most are. And we don't solve the problem of bad parents by treating all parents like they're bad." Dr. Harrison pulled out a folder thick with documents. "Governor, we have reports of increased bullying, higher suicide rates, and decreased academic performance among LGBTQ+ students in states with policies similar to what you're proposing." Bill's jaw tightened. "Dr. Harrison, do you have children?" Yes, I have 2 daughters. And if one of them came to you tomorrow and said she was struggling with her identity, what would you do?" "I'd support her. I'd get her the help she needed." "Exactly. You'd be involved. You'd be part of the solution." Bill's voice softened. "Dr. Harrison, I'm not trying to make life harder for struggling kids. I'm trying to give more parents the chance to be the kind of parent you would be." The room fell silent for a moment. President Walsh looked out the window at the rose garden, where the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. "Governor," she said finally, "what would compromise look like to you?" Bill had been thinking about this question since his meeting with the parents at the community center. Transparency with safeguards. Parents get notified, but there's a process for kids who genuinely fear for their safety. Maybe a waiting period, family counseling, involvement of social services when necessary. A system that protects children while respecting parental rights. Harrison shook his head. "That's still putting vulnerable children at risk." "Dr. Harrison," Bill said, his voice growing firm, "keeping parents in the dark puts children at risk, too, when schools make themselves the sole authority on a child's emotional and psychological development. That's not protection, that's overreach." President Walsh stood up, signaling that the meeting was coming to an end. "Governor Crawford, I appreciate your perspective, but I have to tell you, if Texas moves forward with policies that we believe violate federal law, we'll have no choice but to pursue legal action." Bill maneuvered his wheelchair back from the desk. "Madam President, Texas has been in legal battles with the federal government before. We've won some, lost some, but we've never backed down from defending our principles. Is that a threat, Governor? No, ma'am, it's a promise. As Bill was escorted out of the West Wing, he felt the familiar mixture of determination and exhaustion that came with political warfare. The flight back to Austin would give him time to think, to plan, and to prepare for the storm that was about to break. But first, he had a phone call to make. Sarah, he said when his wife answered, "I'm on my way home. We need to talk." The Crawford family dinner table had always been a place of lively debate, even as the children grew up and moved away. Sunday dinners remained sacred, a time when the governor of Texas became simply Dad, and the weight of political office gave way to the messier, more complicated business of being a family. But tonight felt different. Bill could see it in Sarah's eyes as she passed the mashed potatoes, in the way their son Michael pushed food around his plate, in the careful silence that had replaced their usual animated conversations. "So," Sarah said, finally, her voice carrying the slight edge that Bill had learned to recognize after 28 years of marriage. "How was Washington?" "About what you'd expect," Bill replied. Cutting his steak with methodical precision, the president made her position clear. "We made ours clear. Now we see what happens next." Michael, their eldest at 25, looked up from his plate. As a middle school teacher in Dallas, he'd been watching the controversy unfold with particular interest. "Dad, you know I support you, but it's getting pretty heated at school. Some of the other teachers are saying you're targeting their students. What do you think?" Bill asked. Michael was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I think you're trying to do what you think is right, but I also think some of the kids I teach don't have parents like you and Mom. Some of them. Their parents aren't safe people to talk to about this stuff." Emma, home from law school for the weekend, set down her fork. "Dad, I've been reading the legal briefs. The federal case is going to be complicated. Title X jurisprudence has evolved significantly since the original legislation, and the Supreme Court's recent decisions suggest." "Emma," Sarah interrupted gently, "not tonight. Please." Their youngest, David, 18, and heading to Texas A&M in 2 weeks, had been unusually quiet throughout dinner. Finally, he spoke up. "Dad, my friend Jake, his little sister is trans. She's 14, and she's been having a really hard time. Jake's parents are supportive, but they didn't know she was struggling until she tried to. Until she hurt herself." The table went silent. Bill set down his fork and looked at his youngest son. "Is she okay now?" "Yeah, she's better. But Jake says the school counselor is the one who helped her talk to her parents. He says if there had been some rule about notifying parents right away, she might have done something worse." Bill felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Every policy decision affected real people, real families, real children. It was easy to forget that in the abstract world of legislation and legal briefs. "David," he said quietly, "I'm glad Jake's sister is getting help, and I'm glad her parents are supportive. But what about the parents who want to be supportive but don't know their child is struggling? What about the families who never get the chance to help because they're kept in the dark?" "I don't know, Dad. It's complicated." After dinner, Bill found himself on the back patio with Sarah, the Austin skyline twinkling in the distance. The evening air was finally beginning to cool, carrying the scent of Sarah's garden and the distant sound of traffic on Mopac. "You're worried," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside his wheelchair. "I'm always worried. Goes with the job. This is different. This is personal." Bill was quiet for a long moment, watching a hawk circle overhead. "Sarah, what if I'm wrong?" "About what?" "About all of it. The policies, the politics, the federal fight. What if I'm causing more harm than good?" Sarah reached over and took his hand. "Bill Crawford, in 28 years of marriage, I have never seen you make a decision based on anything other than what you thought was right. You might be wrong. Lord knows you've been wrong before, but you're not wrong about wanting to protect families. But what if protecting some families means hurting others? Then we figure out a way to protect them all." The next morning, Bill called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. The Capitol was buzzing with activity, reporters camped outside, Protesters on the South Lawn, and a steady stream of phone calls from across the country. All right, folks, Bill said as his team gathered around the conference table, we need to talk strategy. The federal government is going to file suit, probably by the end of the week. The media is treating this like a culture war, and half the country is watching to see what we do next. Maria consulted her notes. Governor, we've got support from 8 other states. Governors from Florida, Missouri, South Carolina, and 5 others are planning to file amicus briefs supporting our position. And the opposition, 12 states, have said they'll support the federal lawsuit. California, New York, the usual suspects. Bill's general counsel, a sharp young lawyer named James Rodriguez, leaned forward. Governor, I've been reviewing the legal landscape. This is going to come down to constitutional interpretation, federal power versus state authority, parental rights versus student welfare. It's exactly the kind of case the Supreme Court loves to hear. Timeline, if we're lucky, 18 months. If we're not, 3 years. Bill shook his head. That's a long time for families to be caught in the middle of this fight. Governor, Maria said carefully, there might be another way. What if we tried to find some middle ground? Some compromise that addresses both parental rights and student safety? Bill thought about his conversation with the parents at the community center, about David's friend Jake and his sister, about the complexity of trying to protect everyone in a world where families came in all shapes and sizes. Set up another meeting, he said finally. Parents, teachers, counselors, administrators, people who actually deal with these issues day to day, not politicians. Not activists, just people trying to do right by their kids. Governor, James warned, that's risky. If you move away from your original position, it could look like weakness. Bill turned his wheelchair to face the window, looking out at the Capitol grounds where a group of high school students was taking a tour, their faces bright with excitement about their future. James, he said, sometimes looking weak is better than being wrong. The conference room at the Austin Convention Center had been chosen specifically because it was neutral ground, not a government building, not a school, not a place where anyone could claim home field advantage. Bill arrived early, wanting to see the room set up and get a feel for the space before the participants arrived. 50 chairs arranged in a large circle, no podium, no head table, no hierarchy, just people sitting together, trying to solve a problem. Maria approached with her ever-present clipboard. Governor, we've got 37 confirmed attendees, parents from both sides of the issue, teachers, school counselors, administrators, and a few child psychologists. The media is outside, but per your instructions, they're not allowed in the room. Good. This needs to be a real conversation, not a performance. As people began to filter in, Bill watched the subtle dynamics play out. Parents who supported his policies sat on one side of the circle. Those who opposed sat on the other. But he noticed something interesting. The teachers and counselors seemed to mix more freely, sitting wherever there was an open chair. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a child psychologist from Houston, took a seat directly across from Bill. He'd specifically requested her presence. She was known for her work with LGBTQ+ youth, but was also respected for her emphasis on family involvement in therapy. All right, folks, Bill began once everyone was seated. I want to thank you all for being here. I know this is a difficult and emotional issue for everyone in this room. I asked you here not because I have all the answers, but because I think you might. A murmur rippled through the group. Several people looked surprised. This wasn't the typical political approach to a controversial issue. I want to start with a simple question, Bill continued. What do you think children need most to be successful and happy? A teacher from San Antonio raised her hand. Safety. Physical and emotional safety. Love, said a parent from Dallas. Unconditional love and support. Understanding, added a school counselor from Austin. Someone who really sees them and accepts them for who they are. Bill nodded. I noticed that everything you've mentioned requires relationships. Safety comes from trusting the adults in your life. Love comes from family and community. Understanding comes from people who take the time to really know you. Dr. Reeves leaned forward. Governor, where are you going with this? I'm going here. Dr. Reeves, every one of these needs safety, love, understanding they all work better when the important adults in a child's life are working together, not against each other or in secret from each other. A parent from the earlier community center meeting spoke up. But Governor, what about when those adults aren't safe? What about when involving parents puts a child at risk? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Bill said, and I think it's the wrong question. The room went quiet. Bill could feel the tension building. The right question is, how do we create a system that brings families together instead of driving them apart? How do we help parents become the kind of parents their children need them to be? A school counselor from El Paso raised her hand. Governor, in my experience, most parents want to do right by their kids, but sometimes they don't know how, especially when it comes to issues like gender identity or sexual orientation. Exactly, Bill said. So what if, instead of choosing between parental notification and student safety, we focused on parental education and family support? Dr. Reeves looked intrigued. What would that look like? Bill pulled out a folder he'd been working on for the past week. What if we required schools to notify parents, but we also required them to provide resources, family counseling, support groups, educational materials? What if we made the notification process the beginning of a support system, not the end of a secret? A father from Houston shook his head. Governor, that sounds good in theory, but what about parents who are genuinely hostile? What about kids who get kicked out of their homes? Then we have safeguards, Bill replied. A waiting period for notification if a counselor believes a child is at risk. Mandatory involvement of social services. Emergency housing for kids who need it. A safety net within the system. The conversation continued for 3 hours. Parents shared stories. Teachers described their experiences. And counselors explained the complexities of working with struggling adolescents. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of what a compromise might look like. What I'm hearing, Dr. Reeves said finally, is a system that presumes family involvement, but provides protections for vulnerable children. Transparency with safeguards. Support with accountability. Bill nodded. And most importantly, a system that sees parents and schools as partners, not adversaries. As the meeting wound down, the parent whose transgender daughter had been struggling approached Bill. Governor, she said, I still don't agree with everything you've said, but this feels different. It feels like you're actually trying to solve the problem, not just score political points. After everyone had left, Bill sat alone in the conference room, staring at the empty chairs. His phone buzzed with a text from Maria. Federal lawsuit filed 1 hour ago. DOJ press conference. At 4 p.m., Bill sighed and wheeled himself toward the exit. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time since this controversy started, he felt like he might have found a path forward that didn't require anyone to sacrifice their deepest values. The drive back to the Capitol gave him time to think about the legal fight ahead, the political costs of seeking compromise, and the children and families caught in the middle of it all. But as he pulled into the Capitol parking garage, Bill realized something important. Leadership wasn't about having all the answers. It was about being willing to ask the right questions and to listen to the answers, even when they were complicated. The federal government wanted a fight. The media wanted a spectacle. The activists on both sides wanted a victory. Bill Crawford wanted a solution. And sometimes, in politics as in life, what you wanted mattered less than what you were willing to do to get it. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in New Orleans felt like a cathedral of justice. Its soaring ceilings and marble columns designed to inspire reverence for the law. Bill Crawford sat in his wheelchair at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a team of Texas's finest constitutional lawyers, watching as the federal government made its case against the Lone Star State. 6 months had passed since the lawsuit was filed, and the legal battle had consumed Bill's administration. Every day brought new briefs, new arguments, new attempts by both sides to frame the issue in terms that would appeal to federal judges. Your Honors, the Department of Justice attorney was saying, Texas's policy creates a hostile environment for vulnerable students and violates their fundamental right to equal protection under the law. The state cannot simply ignore federal civil rights protections. In the name of so-called parental rights, Bill watched the 3-judge panel carefully. Judge Maria Gonzalez, appointed by a Democratic president, seemed sympathetic to the federal argument. Judge Robert Hammond, a Republican appointee, appeared more skeptical. Judge Patricia Chen, the swing vote, was harder to read. James Rodriguez, Bill's lead counsel, rose to respond. At 38, James had already argued two cases before the Supreme Court and had built his reputation defending state sovereignty against federal overreach. "Your Honors," James began, his voice carrying the confidence that came from believing deeply in his cause. "This case is not about hostility toward any group of students. It's about the fundamental principle that parents, not government bureaucrats, are responsible for raising their children." Judge Gonzalez leaned forward. "Counselor, what about students whose parents are not supportive? What about children who face rejection or abuse at home?" "Your Honor, Texas has a comprehensive child protection system. We have social services, family courts, emergency shelters. What we don't have is a system that assumes parents are threats to their own children, unless proven otherwise." "But isn't that exactly what you're creating?" Judge Chen asked. "A system that forces schools to potentially expose vulnerable children to harm?" James had been preparing for this question for months. "Your Honor, the policy we're defending includes significant safeguards. If a school counselor believes a child faces genuine danger, there's a process for delaying notification and involving Child Protective Services. We're not forcing anyone to put children at risk." From the gallery, Bill could see representatives from both sides watching intently. Parents who supported the Texas policy sat behind him, while LGBTQ advocacy groups and their supporters filled the seats behind the federal attorneys. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with both sides parsing legal precedents, constitutional interpretations, and competing visions of family life in America. But as Bill listened to the arguments, he found himself thinking about the people this case would ultimately affect: children like David's friend Jake's sister, parents like the woman from the community center meeting, teachers like his son, Michael. During a recess, Bill wheeled himself into the hallway where Maria was waiting with updates from Austin. "How's it going in there?" she asked. "Hard to tell. Judge Chen is the key, and she's playing her cards close to her chest." Bill rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 6 months of legal battles. "What's happening back home?" "Mixed bag. The compromise policy you've been working on is getting support from some moderate voices, but the hardliners on both sides are pushing back. Representative Williams is calling it capitulation to the radical left, and the ACLU is saying it doesn't go far enough to protect students." Bill sighed. "Politicians, sometimes I think they prefer fighting to solving problems." "Governor," Maria said carefully, "there's something else." The White House called. "President Walsh wants to meet again, off the record this time. She's suggesting there might be room for a negotiated settlement." Before Bill could respond, James appeared in the hallway. "Governor, we need to talk. The judges want to hear more about your proposed compromise policy." Judge Chen specifically asked if Texas would be willing to implement it as part of a settlement. Bill felt a spark of hope. "What did you tell them?" "That I'd need to consult with my client." "Governor, this could be our chance to avoid a ruling that might go against us and implement something that actually works for families." The afternoon session focused on the details of Bill's proposed compromise. Mandatory parental notification with safety protocols, required family support resources, and a robust system of safeguards for vulnerable children. For the first time in months of legal wrangling, the courtroom conversation felt less like a battle and more like a problem-solving session. That evening, Bill sat in his hotel room overlooking the Mississippi River, video calling his family back in Austin. "How did it go, Dad?" Emma asked. Having finished law school, she'd been following the case closely. "Better than expected. There might be a path to settlement, which would let us implement the compromise policy without risking a bad precedent." Michael appeared on screen from his apartment in Dallas. "Dad, I've been talking to some of the other teachers about your proposal. A lot of them think it could actually work if it's implemented right." "What do you mean?" "The family support piece is crucial. If schools are going to notify parents, they need to be prepared to help families navigate these conversations. Training for counselors, resources for parents, maybe even support groups. Sarah, sitting beside Bill in the hotel room, squeezed his hand. It sounds like you might have found something that works for everyone, maybe. But there's still the political cost to consider. Both sides are going to see compromise as betrayal. David, now a freshman at Texas A&M, joined the call from his dorm room. Dad, remember what you always told us about leadership? That it's not about making everyone happy, it's about making the right decision even when it's hard. Bill smiled at his youngest son. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Judge Chen had written to both legal teams overnight, proposing a mediated settlement conference. If both sides agreed, they could work out the details of implementation without a formal court ruling. It's unusual, James explained as they prepared for the day's session, but it shows the court is serious about finding a workable solution, rather than just making legal precedent. The federal attorneys huddled on their side of the courtroom, clearly receiving instructions from Washington. Finally, the lead DOJ lawyer approached James. Counselor, we're authorized to participate in settlement discussions, but any agreement would need to include strong federal oversight and specific metrics for protecting student welfare. We can work with that, James replied, as long as the oversight respects state authority and parental rights. Bill watched this dance of legal diplomacy with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. After 6 months of battle, both sides seemed ready to find a way forward that didn't require total victory or complete defeat. But as they prepared to enter settlement negotiations, Bill knew the real test would come when they returned to Texas. Could he convince his own supporters that compromise was better than conflict? Could he implement a policy that protected both parental rights and vulnerable children? The legal battle was ending, but the political challenge was just beginning. The Texas state capitol had seen its share of political storms over the years, but the crowd gathered on the South Lawn on this crisp October morning was unlike anything in recent memory. Supporters of Governor Crawford's original hardline position stood shoulder to shoulder with advocates for LGBTQ+ youth, united only in their opposition to his proposed compromise. Bill watched from his office window as speakers took turns at the microphone, their voices carrying across the Capitol grounds with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Governor Crawford has betrayed the conservative movement, shouted State Representative Tom Williams, his face red with indignation. We elected him to stand firm against federal overreach, not to cave into liberal pressure. From the other side, Sarah Martinez from the Austin chapter of PFLAG was equally fierce in her criticism. This policy still puts vulnerable children at risk. Any notification requirement, even with safeguards, could lead to family rejection and violence. Maria entered the office with a stack of newspapers and her tablet loaded with social media reactions. Governor, you need to see this. The Dallas Morning News editorial calls the compromise pragmatic leadership in polarized times. But the Fort Worth Star-Telegram says, you've abandoned your principles for political expediency. Bill turned from the window, his expression weary. 3 weeks of settlement negotiations had resulted in a framework that both sides could live with barely. The federal government had agreed to allow Texas to implement its parental notification policy with enhanced safeguards, while Texas had agreed to federal monitoring and specific protections for vulnerable students. What about the polls? Bill asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Split pretty evenly. 42% support the compromise, 38% oppose it, 20% undecided. But among your base, Maria hesitated. Just tell me. 58% disapproval. They're calling it the Crawford capitulation. Bill's chief political advisor, Jake Morrison, had been unusually quiet during the morning briefing. Now he spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of 2 decades in Texas politics. Governor, I'm going to be straight with you. This compromise is going to cost you politically, big time. There's already talk of a primary challenge in 2 years, and some of your biggest donors are reconsidering their support. Jake, Bill said quietly, do you think it's the right policy? Jake was silent for a long moment. Honestly, yeah, I do. It protects kids while respecting parents. It brings people together instead of driving them apart. But Governor, Doing the right thing and doing the politically smart thing aren't always the same. The intercom buzzed. "Governor, your 10 a.m. appointment is here." Bill had been dreading this meeting. Pastor Robert Hayes from First Baptist Church of Houston was one of his earliest supporters and most influential backers. The man who had campaigned tirelessly for Bill in 3 elections was not happy about the compromise. "Billy," Pastor Hayes said as he entered the office, using the nickname he'd called Bill since they met 20 years ago. "I've got to tell you, I'm disappointed. Deeply disappointed. I understand, Pastor, but I believe this policy protects families while also protecting vulnerable children. Billy, we didn't elect you to find middle ground with liberals. We elected you to stand firm for our values. This compromise, it legitimizes the very ideology we've been fighting against." Bill wheeled his chair around to face his old friend directly. "Pastor, with respect, I don't think supporting struggling families legitimizes anything except compassion. But you're giving the federal government oversight of our schools. You're accepting their definition of civil rights. I'm accepting a framework that lets Texas implement its own policy while providing protections for children who need them." Pastor Hayes shook his head. "Billy, I've known you since you were a young prosecutor. I've watched you build your career on principle. Don't throw that away now for the sake of political convenience." "Pastor," Bill said, his voice growing firm, "nothing about this has been convenient. This has been the hardest decision of my political career. But sometimes leadership means making the hard choice, even when your friends disagree with you." The conversation continued for another hour, but Bill could see that Pastor Hayes' mind was made up. By the time he left, Bill knew he'd lost more than just a political ally. He'd lost a friend. That afternoon, Bill called a meeting with his family. They gathered in the private residence on the Capitol grounds, the same informal dining room where they'd had so many conversations about politics, family, and the intersection of public service and private life. "I want you all to know what we're facing," Bill began. "This compromise is going to cost me politically, maybe cost me the governorship in 2 years. Definitely going to cost me some friendships and financial support." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand. "Bill, we've been through tough times before. We get through this too." Michael, who had driven down from Dallas for the family meeting, leaned forward. "Dad, I've been watching how this has played out in schools. Teachers are actually optimistic about the compromise. They think it gives them tools to help families instead of just keeping secrets." "And the students?" Bill asked. "Mixed. Some of the LGBTQ+ kids are worried about the notification requirement, but others like the idea that their parents will get resources and support. It's not perfect, but it's better than what we had." Emma, now working at a law firm in Austin, had been quiet throughout the discussion. Finally, she spoke up. "Dad, I've been thinking about legacy. What do you want to be remembered for?" "I don't know, sweetheart. I guess I want to be remembered as someone who tried to do the right thing." "Then you're on the right track. The easy thing would have been to stick with your original position and fight it out in court. The right thing is to find a solution that actually helps families." David, home from college for the weekend, had been scrolling through social media during the conversation. "Dad, you should see some of the comments from my generation. A lot of young people are saying they're impressed that a politician actually listened and changed his mind when presented with new information." "Really?" "Yeah." One tweet I saw said, "Crawford shows that leadership isn't about never changing your mind, it's about being willing to change it when you learn something new." Bill felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The political costs would be real, and the road ahead would be difficult. But his family, the people who mattered most, understood what he was trying to do. That evening, as Bill worked late in his office preparing for the next day's press conference announcing the final settlement agreement, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. 6 months ago, he'd been a governor riding high in the polls, confident in his positions, sure of his support. Now he was a politician who had learned that governing meant more than just standing firm. It meant listening, learning, and sometimes admitting that the world was more complicated than you'd originally thought. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Governor, I have President Walsh on line 1. Bill picked up the phone, curious about what the president might want to say. "Governor Crawford, I wanted to call personally to thank you for your willingness to work with us on this settlement. I know it hasn't been easy for you politically. Madam President, I appreciate the call. I hope this framework can be a model for other states facing similar challenges. I hope so too. Governor, if I may ask, what made you willing to compromise? I know it goes against your usual approach. Bill was quiet for a moment, thinking about all the conversations that had led him to this point with parents, teachers, his own children, and most importantly, with himself. Madam President, I realize that being right about principles doesn't matter much if you're wrong about people. And the people I serve deserve better than a governor who's more interested in fighting than in solving problems. After hanging up, Bill sat in his office looking out at the Capitol grounds, now empty except for security guards and the occasional car passing by. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new criticisms, and new opportunities to lead. But tonight, for the first time in months, Bill Crawford felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The Riverside High School auditorium was packed again, but the atmosphere was dramatically different from the angry town hall meetings of the previous year. Parents, teachers, and students filled the seats, but instead of shouting matches and polarized camps, there was something that had been missing from the education debates for far too long: actual conversation. Governor Bill Crawford sat on the stage alongside Dr. Patricia Reeves, Riverside Superintendent Dr. Morrison, and Maria Santos, who had recently been appointed as the state's first director of Family School Partnerships, a position created as part of the settlement agreement. A year ago, Bill began addressing the crowd. This auditorium was the site of one of the most contentious school board meetings in Texas history. Tonight, we're here to talk about what we've learned from implementing the Texas Family Partnership Policy. Dr. Morrison, who had initially been one of Bill's harshest critics, stepped to the microphone. Governor Crawford, I have to admit I was skeptical about this policy when it was first announced. But what we've seen over the past year has been remarkable. We've had 127 family notifications under the new system, and in 98% of cases, it led to improved family communication and support for the student. What about the other 2%? Asked a parent from the audience. Maria leaned into her microphone. In those cases, our safety protocols kicked in. We involved family counselors, and in 3 instances, child protective services. The key difference is that we didn't just leave families to figure it out on their own. We provided support and resources. A teacher raised her hand. I was one of the biggest opponents of parental notification requirements, but the training we've received and the resources we now have available have made all the difference. Instead of being caught between students and parents, we're now able to help bring families together. Dr. Reeves, who had helped design the training programs for counselors and teachers, shared some statistics. We've seen a 30% increase in family therapy referrals, but more importantly, we've seen a 23% decrease in family conflicts related to LGBTQ+ issues. When parents have support and resources, most of them rise to the occasion. A teenager in the front row stood up. Governor Crawford, I'm transgender, and last year I was terrified of my parents finding out. The school counselor helped me and my parents through the notification process, and it was scary, but it's actually brought us closer together. My parents didn't understand at first, but they got help, and now they're my biggest supporters. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Bill felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with politics and everything to do with seeing real families find their way through difficult challenges. I want to be clear, Bill said when the applause died down. This policy isn't perfect and it doesn't solve every problem, but what it does is create a framework for families, schools, and communities to work together instead of against each other. After the town hall, Bill found himself in conversation with several of the parents who had been most vocal in their opposition the previous year. Governor, said the mother whose transgender daughter had been struggling, I owe you an apology. When this first started, I thought you were just another politician trying to score points against families like mine. But you listened, you learned, and you changed your approach. That meant something. Mom, you don't owe me any apology. You were fighting for your daughter. And that's exactly what you should have been doing as Bill left Riverside High School. That evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The political costs had been real. His approval ratings had taken a significant hit. Several major donors had pulled their support, and he was facing a primary challenger who was running on a platform of principled conservative leadership. But as he drove through the Austin evening traffic, Bill's phone rang with a call from Michael. "Dad, I saw the news coverage of the Riverside meeting. The teachers in my district are asking when we can get the same kind of training and resources you've implemented in other parts of the state. We're working on it, son. It takes time to scale up programs like this. Dad, I'm proud of you. I know this hasn't been easy politically, but you've made a real difference for families." That weekend, the Crawford family gathered for their traditional Sunday dinner. But this time they were joined by some special guests: Jake, David's friend from high school, and his younger sister Alex, the transgender teen whose story had first opened David's eyes to the complexity of these issues. "Governor Crawford," Alex said over dessert, "I wanted to thank you. When all this started, I was angry about the notification requirement, but the way it was implemented, with counselors and family therapy and support groups, it actually helped my family understand what I was going through." Jake nodded. "It was scary at first, but having professional help made all the difference. Instead of my parents trying to figure it out on their own, we had guidance and support." Sarah, who had been largely quiet during the dinner conversation, finally spoke up. "You know, watching this whole process has reminded me why I fell in love with Bill in the first place. Not because he's always right, but because he's always trying to do right." That evening, as Bill sat in his home office reviewing the latest budget proposals for expanding the family partnership program, he came across an email that made him pause. It was from Pastor Hayes, the longtime supporter who had broken with him over the compromise. "Billy," the email read, "I wanted you to know that my daughter came out to me and my wife last month. She's gay, and she was terrified to tell us because she'd heard some of the things I've said from the pulpit over the years. We're working with a counselor now, trying to understand and to rebuild our relationship with her. I still don't agree with all your policies, but I understand now why you fought for resources to help families like mine. Thank you for having the courage to lead even when it cost you support from people like me." Bill sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of leadership in a way that had nothing to do with polls or politics. Real leadership, he'd learned, wasn't about being popular or even about being right. It was about being willing to listen, to learn, and to make hard decisions based on what was best for the people. You served 6 months later as primary election season heated up. Bill faced the toughest political challenge of his career. His opponent, backed by some of his former supporters, was running ads calling him the compromise candidate and weak on conservative values. But on election night, as the results came in, Bill realized something had changed in Texas politics. The voters who came out to support him weren't just his traditional conservative base. They were parents from across the political spectrum who had seen firsthand how the family partnership policy had helped their communities. Governor Maria said as they watched the returns at campaign headquarters, "You're going to win by 12 points. And exit polls show that 67% of voters cite your handling of the education issue as a positive factor." Bill looked around the room at his campaign staff, his family, and the supporters who had stuck with him through the controversy. These weren't all the same people who had supported him for years earlier. Some had left, but others had joined the coalition, drawn by his willingness to put problem-solving ahead of politics. In his victory speech that night, Bill reflected on the lessons of the past 2 years. "Leadership isn't about never changing your mind," he told the crowd. "It's about being willing to change your mind when you learn something new. It's about listening to people who disagree with you. It's about putting the needs of the people you serve ahead of your own political interests." As the crowd cheered, Bill caught sight of Alex and Jake in the audience, now college freshmen themselves. Their presence reminded him that politics, at its best, wasn't about winning or losing. It was about making life better. For real people facing real challenges, the culture wars would continue. Bill knew there would be new controversies, new challenges, new opportunities for leaders to choose between political convenience and principled problem-solving. But in Texas at least, they had proven that it was possible to find common ground even on the most divisive issues, if leaders were willing to listen, learn, and lead. 3 years later, as Governor Bill Crawford announced his decision not to seek re-election, choosing instead to focus on expanding family partnership programs nationally, he reflected on what he'd learned during the most challenging period of his political career. Leadership, he'd discovered, wasn't about having all the answers. It was about asking the right questions, listening to the responses, and having the courage to act on what you learned even when it was politically costly. The Texas Family Partnership Policy had been replicated in 8 other states, and families across the country were benefiting from the framework of transparency with safeguards that had emerged from those contentious months of controversy and compromise. But more importantly, for Bill Crawford, he'd learned that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't winning a political battle. It was finding a way to help people on both sides of that battle find common ground and work together toward solutions that served everyone's children. As he left the governor's office for the final time, Bill thought about the inscription he'd had placed on a plaque in the Capitol. The measure of leadership is not whether you can get people to follow you into battle, but whether you can get them to lay down their weapons and work together for peace. It was a lesson that had cost him politically, personally, and professionally, but it was also a lesson that had made the difference in thousands of families' lives, and for Bill Crawford, that made it all worthwhile.